Now, joining me in studio, I'm joined by former intelligence official with Commanders for Israel Security, Dr. David Shimoni, as well as former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, international affairs analyst Dan Perry. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us this evening. Dan, I want to come to you first because I saw you as Mohammed was speaking, wanting to chime in a little bit about these ongoing operations happening in the West Bank. Mohammed says that right now the main people impacted by this are the civilians inside the West Bank. But what's your opinion?
I don't know about that. I mean, I respect Mohammed Najib very much. Known him for years, and generally speaking, I think he is right about the overall hopelessness of the West Bank situation. But it's a little rich to hear him completely absolve the Palestinian population of October 7th when we see very credible polls showing that the majority of the people in the West Bank supported October 7th. Hamas has probably majority support as a political party in the West Bank. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad find no shortage of volunteers for their terror operations in the West Bank. So to the extent that the Palestinians are one people in the West Bank and Gaza, the complete abdication of responsibility isn't entirely accurate. What is the case in the West Bank is that you legitimately do have an impossible situation where 3 million Palestinians have no rights and 500,000 Jewish settlers have full democratic rights. That level of inequality is going to lead to fermenting anger that will eventually explode in violence anywhere in the world at any time in history. That's just a fact. Now, on top of that, you have specific situations in the West Bank that apply, which are this angry and oppressed population is particularly riled up because of what's happening to their brethren in Gaza. Hamas has a strategy to try to foment a third intifada in the West Bank, quite specifically. Iran is trying to smuggle in weapons all the time, mainly through Jordan, which is a problem in and of itself if some of the weapons stay in Jordan. Adding insult to injury, you have Jewish settlers, extremist Jewish settlers inclined to rampage every now and again in Palestinian villages. A villager, townsman, was killed about 2 weeks ago, and a reckless and irresponsible Israeli government that at the very least is indifferent towards these actions by the extremist settlers. So honestly, it's a bit of a miracle that it's only as bad as it is. And given this context, Israel's security operations in the West Bank are absolutely necessary, because if they weren't happening, and they're not targeting civilians may get in the way, but they're clearly targeting the terror infrastructure of Hamas in particular, and also Islamic Jihad. If they weren't happening, then you'd have a full-blown terrorist offensive against Israel by the extremists, or by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, not only versus the settlers in the West Bank, but also probably into Israel itself.
But why is this such a sticking point, the maintained access of that corridor?
I think there's a military perspective, there's a political perspective, and there's a moral perspective. And the military expressing professional opinion that we can withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor. I'll tell you something, Sarah. The army maneuvers are reversible. If we withdraw from Philadelphia corridor, we can always go back there, especially in the military situation now in Gaza. I mean, the Hamas has lost most of its fighting power as an organized force. These things are reversible. What's not reversible are the lives of hostages that will expire in their captivity. You can't bring them back to life. And we know for a fact that they are dying there. They're dying in the tunnels, they're dying in the underground, being executed. The older people dying of malnutrition, of disease. These things are irreversible.
So who then benefits right now? It sounds like the whole security president, they don't believe that this should be the main issue. So why is it becoming the main issue, Dan?
Well, who benefits? David mentioned the political element, but then didn't elaborate, so I think it falls to me to answer that question in that way. There is a theory, and I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know for sure, but there is a theory that Netanyahu understood on October 7th that he cannot win that discussion about October 7th. It was a debilitating debacle, and if that's the issue at hand, he will be tossed from power, he'll lose the next election, and so forth. And therefore, when the war began in Gaza, his argument all along had been that recriminations over October 7th have to wait until the end of the war. And therefore, who benefits from an extended war is obviously the prime minister and the government that get to delay the unwinnable discussion over October 7th. Now, that may sound cynical to skeptical audience members, but I think the Israeli opposition and many of the people demonstrating are convinced that this is in fact what's going on. Now, the Philadelphia corridor, we have to be fair. It is the border between Gaza and Egypt.
It is a security threat of sorts.
Egypt has failed to stop the smuggling into Gaza, and that is much of what caused Hamas to amass such military force. And so it's not without value. For Israel to control it would be valuable, it would be desirable, but then again, there are plenty of territories in the world that it would be valuable to hold. You know, Italy has nice vineyards. I mean, you can't, you know, much of the Middle East is a threat. You're not going to occupy all of Syria. So it has to be put in the context of the overall picture. The overall picture is this. Israel did not even go into the Philadelphia corridor until quite late into the war. There was no urgency, you know, in the early months of the war. Israel did not mention the need to keep the Philadelphia corridor in perpetuity when it offered the foundational deal to Hamas as presented by President Biden on May 31st. Didn't include the Philadelphia corridor. Only when it appeared as if Hamas might be willing to, in one form or another, accept that deal, which basically was a three-stage withdrawal from all of Gaza in exchange for all the hostages. All of a sudden, the Philadelphia corridor became the center of Israel's security policy. Remember, the Philadelphia corridor was not among the goals of the war. The goals of the war was to return the hostages and to remove Hamas from power in Gaza. Now, Hamas, if the fear is that Hamas would regroup, if the Philadelphia corridor were abandoned, that's because Hamas has not been fully crushed, and because no alternative to Hamas has been allowed to arise in Gaza, because the government won't allow that discussion to even happen.
Dan, when it comes to these numbers, we continue to see more and more polls coming out. It seems there are more and more calls for some elections to be happening here in Israel, but these polls state that the majority of respondents do not want to see Netanyahu running again. However, that number still drops drastically when they're looking at who should replace him. There's not necessarily a clear winner if these elections were held again.
Well, it's not a personal election. Although Netanyahu certainly is personally a factor. I think it's easy to misread the numbers depending on how the questions are asked and how you're inclined to look at it. In fact, what we're really seeing is that the opposition has no one leader who represents all the opponents of Netanyahu. So Netanyahu's support is around 30%. That is why 70% want him to resign, either after the war or many of them, probably most of them, to have resigned already. 70% don't want him and 30% do want him. And when you pit him against other candidates, you see that he still gets his 30, 32, 33%, and none of the others rise much beyond. Mm-hmm. But rest assured that when people went to vote, they would vote for the opposition coalition that, based on today's preferences, would probably crush the existing coalition. And which one among them becomes prime minister will be a matter for various formulas that could be put into place, like which is the biggest party or whatever deals they do internally. It is, however, undoubtedly a failure of the opposition that they've failed to put forth a candidate that truly galvanizes the public's imagination and enjoys their trust to the point where when you ask the people one-on-one, do you support that person or Netanyahu, that person would get the 70% that don't want Netanyahu. So basically the opposition is weak and divided, and that's what's reflected in the polls. But make no mistake, the majority of Israel's voters certainly want Netanyahu to not run again and want him to not be prime minister present. That is obvious, and the reasons are clear. The debacle of October 7th, the failure on an intelligence level, on a tactical level, the strategic failure that followed it, the fact that today we're quibbling over the Philadelphia corridor instead of talking about peace with Saudi Arabia and saving the hostages' lives, all of this has translated into a reduction of Netanyahu's support to perhaps less than a third of the people. And I have to add, about half of that is ultra-Orthodox and extreme right settlers who are two groups that have been bought and paid for because Netanyahu stands for effectively a retention of their special privileges. So if they're factored out, it looks more like 90% of the others want Netanyahu gone. And that, in any parliamentary system, would have led to his resignation. That he clings to power like a man possessed under these circumstances
and right now, Netanyahu's
is a sad thing to behold.
Dr. David Shimoni and Dan Perry, thank you for your analysis on all of the different issues that Israel is battling across the country right now.